a super long one today or anything, but a couple weeks ago I was at my home church and our pastor was talking, and he said, instead of reading the Bible like a Sunday school student, like looking for the answers and stuff like that, he said, read the Bible like a lonely person looking for love. And then I recently started reading through Isaiah, so I kind of just like pick books sometimes and read through them. So I was reading Isaiah 1 and thinking about that, and reading it in a way of a lonely person looking for love. So I want to read that because I think a lot of times our perception of God in the Old Testament is not as loving and a lot more kind of like strict or like judgmental kind of, and people often like see a difference between him in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I think if you read his word differently, then we get to see a side of his heart that we maybe don't see sometimes. Okay, so I'm just going to read Isaiah 1. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib. But Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord, they have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. Why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and raw wounds. They are not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil. Your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence foreigners devour your land. It is desolate as overthrown by foreigners. And the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations, I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall become like wool. If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So that's just part of Isaiah 1. And the first time that I read through it, I kind of, in my head, was like, okay, like God is like telling me, like I need to like get back on the right track, like do the right things, like be in His Word every day, which are like all good things. But it kind of occurred to me as I'm reading it that like that wasn't God's heart behind this. Like He wasn't berating Israel for not like following Him. It's more of like a father like weeping over children who have like walked away from Him. So I think that if you read it from the perspective of like where is like God's love in this, the language that He uses, like saying that His people are estranged from Him, is all like language of sorrow and of weeping. So I kind of just like saw God's heart as like weeping over a lost people. And then especially the part where He talks about, He says, what to me is the multitude of your sacrifices? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I think a lot of times in my mind, I have to do the right thing to gain God's approval, when really His love is already there and He doesn't want me to do the right things. He wants my heart. And so it just really struck me that like God was like, I want your actions, but I want your heart before your actions. And if your actions are empty, then like that's not like what I want from you. And really I just want you to understand my love and to know that like when you walk away from me, I weep over you. Yeah, that's it.
Can you pray? Would you be willing to do a prayer?
Dear Jesus, I just thank you so much for the love that you have for us, God, and I thank you for your patience with us, and God, that you are so willing to chase after us every time that we might walk away from you. And God, I thank you that you have shown us your heart through your scripture, and that you are gracious and merciful and loving and kind, God. And I thank you that even in your punishment, even in your judgment and in your righteousness, that your love still underlies it all, and that you just continue to pursue your people when they are estranged from you. It's in your name.
Amen. Thank you, Kayla. So when you read that, I was thinking about my son and about my relationship with him, and it's the same thing. I mean, I love him no matter what, but if he does things that I don't like, I'm not gonna be super happy with the things that he's doing. So I'm gonna probably talk to him about, say, hey man, this isn't good. You need to kind of figure out some different things. But that is, I think that's a great way to think of when you read scriptures, to read it with a specific purpose. And like you're reading it, thinking about God's love and their relationship. I think that's a great way to approach it. Right now I'm reading through scriptures thinking about something called enlightenment, how the kingdom of God is within me. So I'm looking at Jesus, and I'm looking at the apostles, and I'm looking at them, how they're trying to deepen my spiritual awareness and my awareness of God the Father and the kingdom. So, but that's my intentions when I read now, which is different than I've read in the past. So that is really a wise way to approach it. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, any questions or comments about last lecture? Anything that's on your minds? Okay, here we go. So I think last time we made it through 21. And I think we already made it through this. We did. So let's go to this. Okay. So we're really talking here about the function of proteins. So I've already mentioned yesterday and maybe the day before that many research studies have reported high protein diet leads to autoimmune diseases and other disease processes. Okay, and we are a country that we do eat a lot of meat. We do eat a lot of meat, and we're kind of, the Western diet is looked upon as I don't know how to say this. The diet of the rich. So when other countries look at us, they think this is how we should eat because the Americans eat like this and because of the wealth they have. So when they see us eating so much meat, they think that is kind of something to shoot for. It's something that they should do. So that's kind of some of the philosophy behind why things are changing, or maybe why the culture is changing in so many different areas of the world, where we're getting the Western diet in Japan now, we're getting the Western diet in the Middle East. It's spreading. So why is it spreading? Well, because other countries look at us as being the country that is the most prosperous, and this is what we should eat, and they should eat the same. So that's some of it. But it's shown that high protein diets also lead to all these disease processes. So now Japan and other Eastern countries are starting to get the same disease processes that we have. The diabetes rates are going up. They're getting more cancer. They're getting all this stuff. So, all right. So that was kind of a sidetrack. So let's get back to protein. And really, what brought that all on is the upper limit is 35%, and that's what the Institute of Medicine is recommending, which is pretty high. And we talked about, actually I think we went through this slide last time, didn't we? Yeah, we did. Excess protein. Yeah, so the liver and the kidneys have to work more to get rid of the urea and the ketones. Individuals prone to liver or kidney disease, diabetes, should caution with protein intake, because that can actually further their disease process. Healthy individuals appear to adapt to a higher protein diet for a short period of time, not a long period of time, because it eventually will affect their physical health. And then to metabolize protein requires a lot more oxygen or a lot more water, so you can get dehydrated with a high protein diet. And then the New York Times, and I did talk about this and actually in the last class, the New York Times says that we have 35%. No, that we, what does it say here? Most Americans are double the recommended amount of protein. That's what we're currently eating. So I was on the wrong slides for you guys, wasn't I? So this is the slide that I just talked about. So, and we did this slide. This slide just talks about, okay, so if I know about how much I should be eating, morally, should I be eating more? Should I eat more based on, the world population and consuming more consuming more food, which then also uses more energy? And I mean, should I be doing this or not? Is it ethical? Is it Christian? Something that kind of wrap your mind around. So then now we're going into function. So what is the function of protein? Okay, so when we digest protein, it takes about 2 to 4 hours for us to break it down. And then it goes into the bloodstream. And it takes about 5 to 10 minutes for this protein then to move around the body and distribute itself where it needs to. In that 5 to 10 minutes, what it does is it distributes the protein, the amino acids, into the different amino acid pools. So it builds up the pools, it adds to the pools. So that's what happens right after, well, about 4 hours after digestion. That's what happens. So the amino acids, what they're used for, and we'll just work down the slide here, they provide structure. So for muscle cells, and then they form contractile proteins. So the number 1, protein is used for structure in the body. Number 2, it's used for function. It's used to make up enzymes. Okay? A lot of the amino acids make up these structures called enzymes. So it's also, the cells use nitrogen to form creatine, and creatine is an important part for muscle contraction. So we need this nitrogen from the protein. Okay. So we also have, let's see. We also have protein breakdown in the body, and when we have protein breakdown, when our muscles do have this breakdown process, then all those amino acids are redistributed and they're recycled and they go back into the protein pools. So we have this thing called deamination. And what that is it's a breakdown process. So once the proteins broke down, then nitrogen is eliminated through urine. So but we also have alpha keto acid, which in this breakdown process also contributes to gluconeogenesis. So the breakdown of protein can also lead to the production of glucose, which we've seen in the past, how the protein, there's one slide in particular that shows that proteins can be used in the Krebs cycle. So this slide just explains it a little bit more. So we have our dietary protein that breaks down, like we talked about, then goes into the amino acid pools, which is the fluids in our bodies and the cells, okay? Which then it could be used to synthesize body tissues, hormones, enzymes, okay? And antibodies. And it can also live then, which will help produce skin, hair. But we can also have degradation too, which then feeds back to the amino acid pools, right here, which feed back, which then goes to deamination in the liver, which leads to nitrogen and urea, or it can break down into carbon residue and go into oxygen and be a part of the Krebs cycle. Okay, so this just kind of shows how protein can be moved through the body and how it is used in the body. So, what are the major functions of proteins in human nutrition? Dietary proteins serve all 3 major functions of nutrients. So we talked about this. They form structural bases for the mass majority of body tissue, so structure is one. They form numerous enzymes and hormones to help regulate metabolic function. So number 1, structure, number 2, enzymes, and number 3, they can be used as an energy source if needed. Okay, so this just kind of goes through, and we'll read through the slides. So if everyone can turn to table 6.5 in their book, and this will wake you guys up a little bit. So if you can pull your book out and turn to 6.5, we'll just kind of talk through the different functions here of protein. So number one, we just talked about structural function. So one example is the contractile muscle proteins, actin, myosin in the muscle. Okay. Transport function, they can transport various substances in the blood, such as lipid proteins for conveying triglycerides. So I don't know if you remember when we talked about fats, we have those lipid proteins, or those little balls that we showed up that were on the screen that I showed, and they contain those triglycerides. So these proteins help transport those fats, that fat out to the body, into the cells. Enzyme function, they form almost all enzymes in the body to regulate numerous physiological processes. Hormone and neurotransmitter function form various hormones such as insulin, and also neurotransmitters or neuropeptides that function in the central nervous system, such as serotonin. Immune function, they form key components of the immune system, such as antibiotics. Acid-base balance function, buffer acid and alkaline substances in the blood to maintain optimal pH. That's where that nitrogen plays a big part of the pH. Fluid balance function, exert osmotic pressure to maintain optimal fluid balance in body tissues, particularly in the blood. Energy function, provides source of energy to the Krebs cycle. Movement function, provide movement with structural muscles, proteins used to use energy to contract. All that stuff, proteins, they do a lot of stuff. Important for body function. Okay, so protein and aerobic activity. So protein uses energy source. What is the number one system in the body for energy? What do we use, number one? Carbohydrates. Second is, and third is protein. It's not a very effective source of energy. It requires actually a lot of energy from the body to actually break down proteins in order to make it, in order for them to then work on not neogenesis, I'm thinking of the matrix, but to produce carbohydrates to use for energy source. Okay, so they're not very effective energy source, and it's only about less than 5%. We use for protein less than 5% for energy expenditure throughout the day. So it's not a very effective tool. But when we are starving, this is what our body goes to, is it starts using the protein, because we have no carbohydrates. If we have no carbohydrates, we can't break down fats. So we don't need carbohydrates to break down protein. So protein use during activity. So what we're talking here mostly is about resistance training. So resistance training, it does not increase protein oxidation. So when we, let's see, it does not increase protein oxidation energy source. Oh, as an energy source, okay. So when we do our resistance training, we do not use protein as an energy source at all. We use only carbohydrates, because we're not into, we're only using a non-oxidant, we're using ATP, and it's an anaerobic movement. So when we do resistance training, if we think about when we use our muscles, I mean, we'll break down the muscle tissue, so we'll have micro tears in the muscles. So there is catabolic activity when we do aerobic activity, or when we do anaerobic activity. But then we have this recovery process that happens with the buildup of protein, and that's what causes our muscles to get a little bit better. So they break down, and then they go through this recovery phase, which will then allow them to recover and become larger. So the more you use them, the more demand you have on the muscle, so that it has to respond, and it increases in size to be able to handle the amount of activity that's being demanded.
Dr. Z?
Yep.
That's why you need to make sure that you have enough protein when you lift, right? Because otherwise your muscles won't be able to rebuild themselves.
Yes, so you want to make sure that you do have, So this goes back into how much protein should we have. And so if we're doing a lot of resistance training, so our bodybuilders, they will require higher, bodybuilders or people who exercise and do a lot of anaerobic activity in general, they're gonna require more calories, which is then gonna require more protein. And if they're looking to add musculature on, our body is gonna demand to have more protein in the body to be able to provide that. So yes, so they'll have to eat a little bit more protein than somebody who's doing like aerobic training. So, or someone that's just doing household activities that doesn't require that increased muscle bulk. So resistance training actually will cause that breakdown, and then the recovery phase, the musculature will need that extra protein to allow that protein cell, or not protein cell, but the muscle cell to become larger. Okay. So now we have, let's see, protein use in daily activity. So again, we talked about, protein is just not used that much when we have aerobic activity. So in dynamic exercise, we have an enzyme that is used that oxidizes and breaks down branched chain amino acids. Okay, and then so then what we have is an oxidation of the amino acids, and they're used for the gluconeogenesis. So for prolonged exercise, this is what happens. So the dynamic exercise activates this branched chain amino acid dehydrogenase, which then oxidizes the branched chain amino acids and then breaks them down into amino acids, which then can be used for the neogenesis. Okay? So that's kind of that's the system that the body uses to use proteins when you do prolonged activity, which prolonged activity can also be, the body can perceive that as just also going to starvation mode. Okay. Yeah, that was the slide that you're supposed to go through there. So this is the dynamic exercise activates the dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme that oxidizes the branched chain amino acids, and then the amino acids are then used for the gluconeogenesis. So, and this prolonged exercise, like I was just saying, is mimics starvation. Okay, so this is what it looks like when we have breakdown, muscle breakdown. This is what it leads to. So we start off in the muscle cell, and we have protein breakdown that goes to lutein, which then goes into, this is like an ammonium, and then it combines with pyruvate, which then produces alanine. Alanine goes in the bloodstream, goes into the liver, and then it can be made into glucose, or it's just, it can be converted to urea, and then it's expelled from the body. So this lutein can also go into the alpha keto acid. It can be combined with alpha keto acid and then go into the Krebs cycle and produce energy. So this is the cycle, the two cycles that happen for protein to be turned into energy. One is the alanine process, the other is the alpha keto acid process. Okay, protein use in importance in carbohydrates. Okay, so if we have enough carbohydrates in the body, it's going to spare the protein, because that's what we're going to use for our energy source. So what's the effect of a low carbohydrate diet in general? What's that? If we have a low carbohydrate diet, we're going to utilize fats as much as we can, and then when our carbohydrate stores are depleted, then we're going to burn protein. Okay, at the very last stage, the starvation stage of that. So we have, and this is what we were talking about with the weight training, Kayla, is that we have this thing called adaptation. So the the resistance training leads to increased skeletal muscle protein. And the reason is when we stress an area of the body's going to respond to it. So it's either going to break down, well, it'll probably break down, but then it's going to also build up that tissue to respond to the increased stress level. So if we look at, let's say like elderly, and we put them on a resistance training program, a weight program, what's going to happen to their bone density? It'll go up. So that's called Wolff's Law, and we've added this component of resistance to their body, this extra weight, and their body will respond to it, and so it increases in the bone density. So that's the same thing that happens to skeletal muscle when you do resistance training. So what happens in aerobic training? It leads to increased hemoglobin protein, which in turn leads to an increase in serotonin or serum hemoglobin level, which increases O2 to the muscle cell. So when we do our aerobic training, what happens, the adaptation there is we have this increased hemoglobin level, which then can transport oxygen. And hemoglobin is a protein.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, I feel like a lot of people's conceptions of like what's healthy, like when they are playing sports or like want to build muscle or like lose weight, is like that like carbs are bad and like protein is like really good, so like a lot of protein. But like you wouldn't actually want somebody to do that if they're trying to like build muscle or like get stronger and like lose fat, because if they're not getting the right amount of carbohydrates, their body will be like burning more muscle and like protein, right?
It's just right. It's not as efficient. And then if you're trying to, if we're talking about collegiate athletes, we want them to perform at optimal levels. So we want to make sure that they have all the energy sources possible for them to be able to perform. So if we cut carbohydrates out because they, because of dieting or losing weight, then their performance levels will come down, because then they're going to go to their secondary and third energy sources. So yeah, so getting rid of carbohydrates is not good for performance. But so now we take some disease processes like cancer or something, and I mean, cancer feeds off of carbohydrates. So would we want to have a specialized diet for something like that? Sure. And like type 1 diabetes, would we want to change the diet because carbohydrates maybe we don't want to have, or we want to try to stabilize the glucose levels in the body? Then we would want to have a specialized diet with decreasing carbohydrates. But in general, based on science and based on understanding the human body and how it functions and what energy systems it uses, there's not a real reason just to cut out carbohydrates. So, and it's just not sustainable. I mean, and I think people who are on the ketogenic diet, most of the experts say it is a good way to lose weight and it's a good way to burn fat, but it's just not a sustainable diet. Yeah. So most diets, most of the diets that go away from just eating a balanced diet are non-sustainable. So like the Atkins diet, which is high in protein. All these diets should lose weight right away, because normally you're cutting out a lot of the processed foods. So that works. And then the people will lose their weight. They'll say, okay, I think I'm good, and then they'll start going back to their old diet, and they'll either gain weight or they may eat a little cleaner and healthier, which then they can hopefully maintain it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we have protein synthesis. So has anyone ever heard of eccentric muscle training? Anyone heard of that before? Yeah. There's seen people. Okay, so we have, when I contract a muscle like this, so my bicep, when I pull it like this, and the muscle goes from this length, and I contract and it goes to a shorter length, that's called a concentric contraction. So I'm getting, the muscle fibers are actually contracting like this, okay? And I'm causing a contraction and moving away from here to here with a shortening of the muscle, concentric. Now if I take that same weight and I let it lower down slowly, the muscle's still contracting, but it's getting longer, it's elongating. That's called eccentric. So I'm fighting the resistance of the weight as my muscle gets longer, Concentric is when I pull my hand towards my face, the muscle gets shorter, and when I have a weight and it resists it, it's called eccentric. A lot of people use eccentric training. A lot of athletes use eccentric training, and the idea behind it is to increase muscle strength, okay? To try to even increase it more than concentric work, or I'm sorry, than the concentric work. So for instance, if I'm doing a bench press, I'm pushing out like this is called a concentric contraction. If I let the weight go down really slowly, it's an eccentric contraction. So there's a lot of people, there's a lot of theories out there that if I work heavily on eccentrics, I can get stronger. Well, what happens is there's increased breakdown with eccentric contractions, so we actually, the muscle fibers will break down more during eccentric work. But then also we get this recovery phase when then they'll actually build more muscle because of the breakdown that they went through. So eccentric work does work, but it doesn't target the muscle belly as much as it targets the myotendinous juncture. Okay, so it's not as effective as everybody thinks for building muscle belly bulk. Belly bulk, yeah. It's better at the myotendinous juncture. So it actually builds, it strengthens the tendons more. So when people have tendon problems, and they have tendinitis or tendinosis, tendinitis is just an inflammation that's around a tendon. That's what it's that's the definition of it. Tendinosis is actually, there's an infiltration of capillaries into the tendon, and it weakens the tendon, okay? So eccentric work works more on the tendinous structures than it really does the muscle belly, so. So, do athletes need more protein? So, really, it's varying. There's so many different thoughts on this. And when I tell you something, I've got this research on this certain topic. Let's say fasting is great. I'm sure you can go out and find 5 articles that say fasting is not good for these reasons. So there's a lot of varying opinions on different diets, on different nutritional supplements. So there's a lot going on. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide you the most current research, so you guys can use that information and kind of bank on that. So should athletes eat more protein? So the American College of Sports Medicine says yes. The American Dietary Association says yes. The Dietary Council says yes. They all say that we need more protein, and that does make sense. If we're using the musculature more, high demands, yeah, I mean, you're going to use more calories and you're going to need more protein in your diet. It just makes sense, okay? But then we have the National Academy of Science and the dietary recommended intake say no. So, and then, do we need less protein? Well, I think if you're doing resistance training, I think that doesn't make sense at all. More demand on the body and we provide less nutrients to it, doesn't make any sense. So we go back to our general recommendation of 0.8 kilograms for adults, okay? So we want to maintain that 10 to 35%, and really for standard American person, it's like 10 to 15%, and that's what the World Health Organization says, between 10 and 15%. So really that's the main guide for non-athletes, and then athletes need to determine how many calories they're burning, and then based on calories, then they need to figure out how much protein. So, but really the 0.8 kilograms is really a good starting spot. Okay. So then also consuming complete proteins or complementary combinations. We talked about that a little bit last time too. Just know that if we eat a variety of food, that's going to keep our amino acid pools stored with all the amino acids that we need. Okay. So now this table in your book, table 6.7, does say that with weight training, there's a variation of your protein intake. So the latest research says that, if you add about 20 grams more of protein to the 0.8 grams per kilogram for resistance trainers, people who are doing more anaerobic activity, that's pretty standard. For aerobic activity people, it's pretty much the point A. The book says this, so I need to give you this information because this is what the book says. You know, the latest research doesn't necessarily support this. There's a lot of pro football players and pro athletes that are on vegan diets and on different diets where their protein levels are less, and they actually thrive. They thrive. So and this is how we're going to calculate protein. So this is just the percent of protein for someone who has like a 4,000 calorie diet. So here's our calories in protein, which is about 600 grams of protein, 131 to 150. So it comes out to be like 0.9 to 2.1 grams per kilogram, which I think is toxic. So that's my own personal opinion. So. Okay. So we have something called the central fatigue hypothesis. This means with prolonged exercise and the breakdowns of our proteins in our body, what happens is we get high tryptophan levels and we have low branch chain amino acids, which lead to fatigue. And why is that? And the main reason is because what happens is with the increase, let's see, so when we have this ratio of high tryptophan and low branch branch chain amino acids drop, what that does is it increases serotonin production in the nervous system, and the serotonin then stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which then creates fatigue. So this ratio, when it's out of balance, increases serotonin levels in the body. And that has the effect on the central nervous system, which is the parasympathetic. So this is how, if we're to gain 1 pound of muscle mass, how many grams of protein, extra protein, do we need per day? Okay. So first of all, we need to know how much the person weighs. So this is a 70 kilogram athlete. So we know that this person, we said young athlete. So we know that about 65 grams a day is needed for protein. But if we want to add pounds of muscle mass, how many grams of protein do we need? So if we work through this, 1 pound of muscle equals 454 grams. Muscle is 20% protein. If we take the 454 times 0.2, what we have is 100 grams of protein as in 1 pound of muscle. So 100 grams divided by 7, so we need 14 grams of protein extra in our diet for us to increase, to get 1 pound of muscle per week. So 14 grams extra per week based on this body weight. Okay, so do we need to consume protein? Do we need to combine protein and carbohydrates? So if you want to build muscle mass and strength training, yes, we need to have carbohydrates combined with proteins. That's what they found is most effective. Okay, and it's about a 4 to 1 ratio, a 3 to 1 ratio. That's what they're finding to be most effective, with the 3 or 4 being the carbohydrate and the 1 being the protein. Okay. Let's see what I got for my next slide here. So this is what I just talked about, the 3 to 1 or the 4 to 1 ratio. So an example of that would, banana or apple with peanut butter on it. And then we do have some commercial products. And then, then the milk industry really pushes chocolate milk because we've got the protein and we've got the carbohydrates combined. So I don't know if you've seen that, but that's pushed with a lot of athletes to drink before and after their strength training is to use chocolate milk.
So I know you're not a huge fan of dairy, so how do you feel about like chocolate, like almond milk or like plant-based milks?
Yeah, so I think they're fine. what kind of nutrient values are you getting from them, so you have to look at that. So when I have almond milk, it's not very high in protein, and it is fortified with vitamin D and calcium, so that's always good. But then, I mean, I just look at the label and say, okay, I'm gonna drink this stuff, and why? I mean, what's it gonna do for me? I mean, if I'm drinking it just because it tastes good, I mean, that's one thing, pleasure. That's always good. But then, I mean, normally, the almond milk that tastes good has a lot of sugar in it too, so then you have to weigh that out. So if I'm gonna do like a milk product or a milk substitute, what I'll do is, like almond cashew milk has really high in protein. So I'll drink that because that helps my protein intake for the day. So again, if it has good nutrients in it, then I'll do it. So, yeah. Okay. So, does the consumption of individual amino acid supplements pose any health risk? So it's been established that really when you take amino acids, it doesn't really do, it's not an ergogenic aid, so it can't really help you when you take it individually, okay? So so when you use dietary supplements for free amino acids, there's just not a lot of good research that says, hey, this is going to be very helpful. So excessive amounts may cause health problems. So it could interfere and with amino acid absorption and cause gastrointestinal distress. So the best advice I can give you about getting your amino acids is just through food. So and that was one of the things when I was a bodybuilder, everyone was taking branched chain amino acids trying to improve their athletic performance. And the reality is it didn't work. The research shows it just doesn't work. Doesn't help with athletic performance or just the human body, and its daily function doesn't improve it. So now if you are, but again, you know, all this gets negated when you have a disease process, okay? So, I mean, there's certain disease processes that need certain supplements to their diets, okay? So like me, for instance, I mean, I'm vegan, so I thought, man, I was eating clean, I'm eating good, and then I started to do chronometer, I realized, man, I'm not getting any of my B's, I'm low in C's, I'm missing all of these nutrient levels in my body. So so I just realized, boom, I've got to supplement with that. And I think when we do this, we'll all figure out what we're lacking, and I think it'll help everybody perform, you know, even schoolwork better if you're getting all the dietary supplements you need.
So can you add, like, if you take a daily vitamin, can you add that into Chronometer?
Yep.
Okay.
You can scan it. It's got a barcode scanning on it. It's really cool. So, yeah. And if it's not, you can scan it, take a picture, send it to the company, then they'll add it. So, it's kind of cool. Yeah. Okay. It is 9:44. Yeah, I think we're just calling it good. You guys can go home. There won't be any. So let me just see how I need to do it, because otherwise it would just get the nutrition. Yeah, if you could do it on another sheet, that would help.
Yeah. You know what that means? I have to go to the sacred ground. You gotta do it. And you're down.